Mrs. Rochester recalls how she met her future husband and how she became a prisoner at Thornfield Hall. In the opening scene, we see the already imprisoned Antoinette getting scolded by one of the hall's maids for constantly trying to escape. Closing the curtains, the maid lets her know that they won't tolerate any more tricks from her and that she'll be staying in the attic. Confused, Antoinette asks whether they're going to England, but the maid tells her that they already are in England, waiting for the maid to fall asleep. Antoinette steals her lantern and keys from the room so she can sneak out and find her king. After searching along the dark castle, she finally finds him sound asleep on a chair. Getting closer, she sees the man she once loved sleeping peacefully, despite knowing what kind of torture she's going through. Regardless, she still loves him and longs for his touch, which is why she remembers all the times they've made love as she gets closer to him. Trying to kiss his neck, he suddenly moves, making her drop the candle. A huge fire erupts, but the only thing she can focus on is a picture on a wall that resembles the paths from where she comes from before meeting her husband. Antoinette was living in Jamaica with her aunt. On one particular day, we see that her future husband, Edward Rochester, has come to take the hand of the young Antoinette as his father has pressured him into marrying. Edward would inherit everything Antoinette has, therefore, the legacy of his family will be continued. Despite being in for a great deal, Edward seems rather upset that he'll have to marry without knowing the bride, but Richard is sure that he'll love her. Around noon, we see Antoinette and Aunt Cora reading as they're waiting for Richard and Edward to arrive. The men get there on time, and Edward catches her interest almost immediately. He's been in Jamaica for a week, but has fallen sick due to the weather. Antoinette feels bad for him, but he lets her know that it's worth it since he can see her face. After enjoying a cup of tea, Antoinette takes him on a walk around their royal property. Although she loves living in Jamaica, she admits to admiring pictures of England often. England is a great place, but Edward claims to be fascinated by the beauty of Jamaica. As their conversation continues, Antoinette seems to be excited about meeting him and claims that she's trying hard to win him over. He lets her know that she's winning him, despite not meaning it. Instead, he asks about the plantations, and she tells him that they were her father's, who was a slave owner. He disagrees with the idea of slave ownership, but she assures him that it was only practiced by her daily in the past. Her mother had remarried, but after her passing, Antoinette had found herself in Jamaica. Edward thinks that it must be sad that her mother had such a short life, but she asks him to talk about positive things, not wanting to ruin their beautiful afternoon. Curious, she asks about his family, and is surprised to find out that in their tradition, the first son inherits everything. The second son is left to make his own living, which is why Edward has come to the island. Antoinette finds it amusing that he's come to the islands like a pirate seeking treasure. Closing her eyes, she breathes the fresh air and claims that she can fly. Asking whether he feels the same, she hopes that he will say the same, but he claims that he's on the ground. Edward almost lets his true colors show, but he recovers by claiming that he's on the ground to catch her if she falls. Their first meeting goes monthly, but Edward isn't sure if he wants to marry her. Richard pushes him to accept, claiming that they're a perfect match when it comes to their titles. Edward knows why his father is forcing him to marry, but he wonders why they're trying to get rid of Antoinette. Richard claims to have no reason other than to fulfill his father's wishes, admitting that he doesn't want to be her guardian anymore. Even though he knows that he won't be happy, he agrees to ask her to marry him because it'll make his father happy. Edward asks Antoinette for her hand, and she can't be happier. Soon, they gather all friends and family to announce their engagement. And while everyone seems to be delighted, Edward's anger towards his father grows bigger. He writes his father a letter, assuring him that he will do everything to honor their name, and claims to have sold his soul for it. He lets him know that all of her money will be his, so they wouldn't have to worry about his financial status. As he finishes the letter, darkness takes over him, and he rips the letter in anger. Edward might be staying silent, but Aunt Cora decides to advise Antoinette against marrying him. Richard had set it up for Edward to have all of Antoinette's financial benefits, including her security. Cora reminds her that she'll be left with nothing, but Antoinette claims that Edward is enough for her. Being older and wiser, Cora begs her not to marry because she is young and shouldn't jump at the first guy who wants to marry her. Antoinette claims that she's in love, which angers her aunt even more. Grabbing her wrists, Cora gets in her face and demands she spends more time with him to get to know everything about him. Luckily, Antoinette decides to listen to her aunt and calls off the engagement the following morning. Given that his plan has flopped, he storms into her room furious, demanding to know why she had called their engagement off. Scared, she moves away from him and stands by the window. Quietly, she admits to being afraid of the future. He claims to be happy with her, but she doesn't believe him. Her reasoning being that Aunt Cora doesn't like him. Stepping closer to her, he claims to understand her dislike for him as protection because she doesn't want to lose her. When it comes to Richard, he insists that it's just the way men talk and that they're not disagreeing all the time. She stays quiet, so he proceeds to use romantic words to assure her that he loves her. Wrapping his arms around her belly, he claims to be his best self when around her. She doesn't believe him because they don't know anything about each other. Tightening his grip, he assures her that he wants to marry her and make her the happiest, asking whether it's enough for her. He kisses her neck and wins her over again. Turning around, he caresses her cheeks, promising to make her happy and keep her safe while giving her everything she needs. However, all she asks for is peace, which he promises to give her. In no time, they decide to get married, but Aunt Cora stands by her words, knowing that their marriage will end disastrously. Antoinette decides not to listen to her and gets married to the man she's sure will love her. As the bells of the church ring, Cora can't help but shed tears for Antoinette. In no time, the newlywed couple can be seen traveling to the honeymoon house on the hill to spend some time together. After passing through woods and jungles, they arrive at the palace, and Antoinette couldn't be happier to see her old nurse, Christophine. Dragging him inside, Antoinette can't wait to show him around her favorite place in the world. She pours them a glass of wine, and they raise a toast to their happiness. In their suite, Edward decides to look around when he finds himself in the dressing room. From the window, the new maid Amelia appears, informing him that the room used to be Mr. Mason's. Given that it's cold at night, she puts down some blankets on the bed. Edward barely acknowledges her, but what gets his attention is when she repeats the exact same words Antoinette said at the beginning of their tour around the house. Her sarcastic tone is what sets him off, but he decides to ignore it. In the evening, they enjoy their first dinner as a married couple. Antoinette worries about his opinion, so she asks whether he likes where they're staying. He assures her that she does, and she claims that she loves the place like a person. After dinner, they sit by the bridge and talk about life. The sweet scent around them catches his attention, so he asks why it smells so good. He's pleasantly surprised to find out that some flowers open up at night, so the scent is sweeter. He can tell how connected she is to the place, as she doesn't stop talking about it. The weather may be wearing, but they shouldn't sleep under the moonlight, is what Antoinette claims. Christophine had warned her about sleeping under the moonlight when she was just a child, so it has stuck with her. Looking deeply into her eyes, he leans in, and they share a passionate kiss. Wanting to enjoy each other, they head to their room and get ready for their first night as a married couple. After taking a sip from the red wine for good luck, they spend the night making love. In the morning, Edward gets awoken by some noises coming from outside, only to see Antoinette already awake. Seeing him awake makes her heart jump, so she jumps into his embrace. They want to continue the fun from the previous night, but Christophine knocks on the door with fresh coffee in her hand. She serves Edward as he lays in bed confused. Trying the coffee, he compliments it on how well it tastes, but gets confused once she refers to it as monkey piss. Antoinette giggles, knowing that he doesn't understand their Jamaican slang. In the afternoon, they head to the river where they can't seem to keep their hands off each other. Out of the water, Antoinette picks up some rocks and decides to skip them in the water. Impressed by her skills, he assumes that a boy must have taught her how to throw them, and she confirms that her friend has. He comments on knowing nothing about her, but she assures him that they have all the time in the world to learn so much about each other. They return to the palace, where they spend the rest of the afternoon in the yard, holding each other's hand. Antoinette talks about wanting to go to London since she was a child, and believing that she'll be safe and sound there. Edward reminds her that she's safe and sound with him, and she can't help but look at him with sucky adoration, falling directly to his lies. Used to the warm weather, she begins wondering what the naked trees and snow look like in England, which he promises to show her. They finish the day by making love, and as they cuddle in bed, Antoinette gets up to get ready for dinner. Instead of her usual golden dress, he asks her to put on a red one and to put her hair up to expose her shoulders. As she gets dressed, he can't help but admire her beauty. He touches her neck until it reaches her heart. Placing his hand directly on it, she asks him to feel how fast it is beating for him. Already unnerved, he jumps at the sight of Christophine, so he sits on his chair and lets her serve the dinner. The following sunny morning, he decides to check the bookshelves in search of a good read. However, as he opens one of them, he sees that the pages have been scribbled, and there are no actual words in them. Out of the open door, he hears someone telling him that books are no good at where they're staying, so he turns only to be met with Christophine. He asks for privacy, but she lets him know that he'll have to learn how to cover his ears since he keeps leaving the door open. He quickly closes the doors on her, feeling even stranger about being around them. What sets it for him is when Antoinette starts digging for treasures. As time passes, she becomes more obsessed with him, while strange occurrences happen to Edward that make him feel weird about being at the house. One night, as they're making love, she decides to let him know how much he means to her. She has given up on herself only to be by him, so if he asks her to perish, she claims to do it for him. That following morning, as Edward is getting fresh air, an unknown man approaches the entrance. He introduces himself by his surname, Causeway, and claims to be the son of Antoinette's stepfather. Causeway claims that he had come to help Edward, revealing that the family is from madness and that no money could ever help him stay in. He claims that Antoinette's mother is a lunatic who has tried to murder her husband. Continuing to say nasty things about Antoinette and the family, Causeway gets yelled at by Edward, who reminds him that he's speaking about his wife. Before leaving, the man tells Edward that Amélie knows him personally and that he should ask her about him if he ever wants to talk. Although he defends his wife, Edward can't help but believe everything the man has said. In their room, we see Antoinette drinking her coffee with Christophine by her side. Given that she's a happy woman, Christophine knows that she doesn't need her anymore and decides to go back to her house. Antoinette is saddened because she will miss Christophine, but understands her decision. As they're saying goodbye, Edward walks by and ignores the both of them. However, as he heads outside, he passes Amélie by the door, and he smiles at him. Christophine notices that and warns the young girl that she will hurt her if she smiles at him once again. Concerned, Edward stands up to Christophine, but she seems unbothered. Paying him no mind, she takes Antoinette to the entrance before saying goodbye to her. Antoinette sends her home with a smile, but once she turns to Edward, she asks about his attitude. Having major doubts, he asks whether she remembers her mother's passing. She nods her head and shakily reveals that she was only 11 years old on her passing. He accuses her of lying, but she wonders why he's acting so weird. Instead of answering any of her questions, he tells her that she's weird for wearing her nightgown during the day. Going back and forth, she gets hurt once he orders her to get changed, so she slams the door on him. Taking the bottle of whiskey, he heads to the other room and gets severely drunk sometime later. The new maid, Amélie, brings water for Antoinette, so he takes the chance to ask whether she knows anything about Antoinette's mother. She refuses to reveal anything at first, but he commands her to tell him everything she knows. Amélie tells the same story as the mysterious man, how the mother is a locked-up lunatic, making him believe the story. After talking with Edward, Amélie goes to Antoinette's room to clean up. They get into a fight once Amélie calls her a bad wife, among many other nasty names that result in Antoinette attacking Amélie. Luckily, Edward separates them, but he seems to be on Amélie's side, making Antoinette go crazier. After the incident, Edward decides to take a stroll in the jungle, but he keeps hearing different voices as he goes deeper and deeper. All of a sudden, the strange man appears and is sure that Edward has only come for more answers. Surprisingly, he reveals that Christophine is an Omaha woman, meaning that she practices dark magic and is far more dangerous than Antoinette. Not only that, he mentions a boy named Sandy who used to be with Antoinette and advises Edward to ask about him. The man starts talking badly about Antoinette's family, and in the end, decides to threaten Edward. If he doesn't give him 500 pounds, he will make sure that everyone knows about the dark secrets. Unable to listen to him anymore, Edward runs off into the jungle as far as he can from him. After running for some time, he sits between the trees to rest when Antoinette kneels in front of him. She apologizes for her outburst and begs him to forgive her, asking to be his sweet Antoinette again. However, he doesn't think that she's done anything to apologize. Confused, she asks why he's acting so cold towards her, but he doesn't answer her. Instead, he tells her that he's never liked her name and recommends he come up with a new one for her. Shocked, she watches as he leaves, before screaming out that it's her name. In the evening, she struggles to fall asleep, and therefore hears muffling behind her. Turning around, she sees Edward peeking at her from the curtains, but once he locks eyes with her, he leaves. She continues to sob and feel devastated, which is why she decides to visit Christophine. She begs for advice from her old friend. So Christophine advises her to leave him, because the more she tries, the more he'll hate her. That isn't an option for Antoinette, as she claims that she can't bear to live without Edward. The best advice Christophine can give her is to let him be, as she's a rich white woman, who he will always come to. However, she doesn't know about the English law, and once Antoinette tells her, Christophine becomes afraid for her friend. Walking away, she enters the barn and Antoinette follows, pleading to be given the right potion so he would love her again. Pacing back and forth, Christophine lets her know that she can't have any as it would bring only evil in their household. The poor girl begs for something, so he would lay with her at least one more time in hopes that she would make him love her again. But Christophine advises her to tell him the truth. Edward is only distant because he keeps hearing stories and doesn't know who to trust. Antoinette should tell the truth, but she advises her not to be hysterical and not to cry. Antoinette decides to listen to her advice only if she gives her what she wants. They agree on the plan and Antoinette decides to be honest with Edward. That same evening, being honest with her husband, she reveals that Christophine had advised her to leave him because she can't stand seeing her being hated by the man she loves. Edward protests, however, claiming that he doesn't hate her, but that he's rather concerned about her. Still confused about his behavior, she asks why he treats her like he does. He doesn't answer her question, but asks whether her mother is alive. Remembering Christophine's advice, Antoinette reveals that her mother had passed away the previous summer, and not when she was 11. Feeling betrayed, he tells her that she's lied to him. Losing her temper, Antoinette gets up and explains that many people make up lies about her mother when the truth is that she had had 2 deaths. Despite wanting to stay calm, Antoinette loses her cool and starts screaming. All she asks is for Edward to listen to her, and seeing in what kind of state he has brought her in, he promises to listen as she talks about her mother. After calming down, Antoinette reveals that she had lost her brother Pierre to the fire set up by the people who disapprove of her mother. Somehow, her mother had survived the fire, which had resulted in her blaming Mr. Mason for his death. In the end, Mr. Manson had had enough, so he hired people to take care of her, which eventually caused her to become mad. Antoinette claims that they've tried to keep her away, but she had managed to visit the place where they kept her mother one day. Her mother's cries could be heard for miles as Antoinette approached the place. However, instead of seeing the mother she knew, she saw a fragile woman being by a black man. Tears fall down her face as she recalls seeing her mother in such a terrible state, and he doesn't shy away from it too. Trying her best not to shiver, she curls up, and he sits next to her. Using his empathy, she gets up to go to bed and asks whether he could wish her a good night. He agrees, but given that he's shocked by the story, he stays on the couch for a bit. So she uses the time to pour drinks for them and eventually put the poison in them. Noticing that he's in a vulnerable state, she uses his weakness by handing him a glass of wine and asking him to remember their good old days. They end up making love as the poison hits Edward. However, he wakes up in the morning with severe pain and notices Antoinette's back full of bruises. Turning his head to the drinks, he notices his glass filled with thick liquid at the bottom. Struggling to get up from the pain, he uses all his strength to write poison on the mirror. Wasting no time, he goes to the river and tries to freshen up in the cold water. As he struggles to catch his breath, flashbacks of the previous night come to him, where it's visible that something has taken over him. Shortly after his awakening, Antoinette wakes up and smells the sheets that have his scent. However, as she turns to face the glasses, she realizes the fatal mistake she had made and the written word on the mirror. Begging to sob, she rushes to the mirror and tries to wipe the name off the mirror. Evening comes and Edward finally returns to the palace, looking better. On his way to his room, he walks past Amelia and asks her to bring him something to eat. Antoinette watches as he openly flirts with a young maid. Shortly after his order, we see Amelia going to his room and serving him some fresh stew. Confused, he asks why she's feeding him, and she reveals that she feels sorry for him. Taking the plate off her hands, he puts it aside before kissing her passionately. Unfortunately, Antoinette comes to the door and hears their heavy breathing as they engage in sexual intercourse, without realizing that Antoinette is just on the other side. In the morning, Edward asks whether she still feels sorry for him, and Amelia admits that she not only feels sorry for him, but for Antoinette as well. Instead of talking to him, Antoinette decides to spend her day at Christophine's, giving him the whole day to think about what he's done. Although he spends his whole day lying around, he tries talking to her once she comes back in the evening. Ignoring him completely, she pours herself a drink, even though he doesn't think it is a smart idea for her to be drinking. She heads to her room, but stops only to let him know how much she hates him, promising to show him just as much until she dies. He has ruined the only place she thought she had when everything would turn bad, and he will never be forgiven for that. Taking the bottle of liquor, she heads back to her room, but he tries to snatch the bottle from her hand. After pulling and pushing, Antoinette smashes the bottle, breaking it in half. With a sharp hand, she threatens to stab him if he dares to touch her, and he watches with his eyes wide. All of a sudden, Christophine appears, and she reminds her not to cry, while we see that Edward is trying his best to stop crying. Before leaving, Christophine lets him know that he will burn in hell for making Antoinette go mad. Before going to bed, he decides to take matters into his own hands. He begins writing his father a letter about how he had fooled him into marrying a lunatic, but decides not to send him one either way, as he plans to accept the beautiful lunatic to be by his side forever. Instead of staying on the islands, he decides to take Antoinette to England, where the finest doctors will be taking care of her. She knows that the doctor will say whatever he wants to hear, but he asks her to trust him. Turning to face him, she tells him that she can't trust him because she knows nothing about him. He knows that she's right, so he decides to be truthful. Finally, he admits that it would be hell for her because he knows how much she hates him. So therefore, they shall see who hates each other more. They take the trip to England, but get lost after crossing the wide Sargasso Sea. At least that is what Antoinette tells us as the castle burns to ashes before she jumps in the window with a huge smile on her face, ending the misery once and for all.